listening to Let's Get Surety. Let me hear your bonding talk with Kat Shamapande.
Hi, it's Kat Shamapande here, and I've got two great guests here with me today. NASBP's CEO, Mark McCallum.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here.
And General Counsel at NASBP, Martha Perkins.
Hey, Kat, glad to be here.
Thanks for being on the episode, you guys. So today we're going to talk about individual surety. I know this is something that everyone in the surety industry wants to learn more about. It's something that our industry is plagued with. So let's talk about it. What is individual surety?
You know, it is a critically important subject that I think is little understood, but it's just like the name suggests. It's actually individuals, natural persons who are agreeing to act as a surety for a contractual obligation.
Okay.
And, you know, that's how it was way back when before corporate surety. But now we'll kind of get into why that's a problem now, because a lot of times they're acting as unauthorized sureties on these contracts.
So what do you mean by unauthorized?
Meaning that, you know, unless there is an exception, such as in the federal government, we'll talk about that a little bit later, they are actually acting without proper authority. So sureties and insurers are, they're regulated at the state level. And anybody who's going to act as a surety insurer in a particular jurisdiction need to have a certificate of authority from the insurance commissioner. So when they don't have that and they're acting as a surety, they are in fact acting as an unauthorized surety. And that brings its own problems.
Okay. Are there any easy ways to identify an individual surety?
You know, there are. And one of the things that I always suggest to producers and contractors and others is that the first thing they ask an individual surety is for them to produce that certificate of authority from the insurance commissioner in the jurisdiction in which they're placing that bond. If they can't produce that, then you know that they're not authorized and, you know, buyer beware.
Okay.
And let me interject something there, Mark, if I could. Sometimes they will produce a piece of paper and say, this is my authority, but it's not a certificate of authority from the insurance department in the state in which they want to, where the project is located,
so
and they're going to issue the bond.
State,
or no, it tends to be something like a certificate of authority to do business. Just a business license, which is not enough. You have to have the Department of Insurance in that state having issued a certificate of authority to do business as a surety insurer.
Right. That's a great point, Martha. You know, it just can't be a business license. That doesn't get you across the finish line. Okay. You have to have that certificate of authority to act as an insurer. And you know what? It's fairly easy to find out whether or not they're authorized. So state insurance departments maintain lists of currently authorized insurance companies who write surety. Okay. You can actually call the state insurance department, and some of them actually post who is authorized, so you can look that up on their websites.
So it sounds like it's pretty easy to identify them. So why is it such a plaguing issue? Why do they operate so long?
That's a great question. I sometimes scratch my head about that, but I think a lot of times people aren't doing the due diligence. They simply don't know to do the due diligence. Some of these folks who are acting, you know, in an unscrupulous, unauthorized manner, they're trying to dupe you. So they may have fancy paper. They may have names that are similar to kind of trusted names in the insurance business. And if you don't know enough to look behind the paper or verify that that is, in fact, the correct name, you may get duped into accepting a bond that is really worthless.
Okay. And you said it's more important now. Martha, did you want to add something?
What I was when Mark just said that a bond that is worthless, so individual sureties often will have these bonds that really are not worth the paper they're written on. And the only way to find out is when somebody tries to make a claim on one of the bonds, and the individual surety either flees, never responds, or says, oh, you didn't look at the fine print. It says it was only good for 6 months. Or they will have an excuse about why they're not going to pay on something that an entity thought it had a promise for.
There's a misnomer out there that unless there's a claim on a bond, even if it's a what I call a worthless bond, there's nothing behind it.
Yeah.
That's nobody is the victim. And I would contend that's not the case at all. As a matter of fact, that means that a company that should have been awarded that contract, with a legitimate bond, didn't receive that award. That means that the owner who thought they had that security in that vetting process really didn't get that.
Yeah.
So even when there's not a claim and maybe that the contract goes off, they're still victims.
That makes sense. So can you tell me a little bit about state requirements around?
Right. So as we said, it's vitally important that any surety that someone's going to do business with, if you're a producer, for example, or where they're going to accept a bond from that entity, that they have that certificate of authority to act as an insurer in the jurisdiction of the project in the case of a construction project. There are exceptions. So one of the most notable exceptions is at the federal level. And on federal work, there are, they call it FAR, Federal Acquisition Regulations, that will permit natural persons, individual sureties, to provide bonds on federal construction projects. Unfortunately, there really is no vetting of those individuals before they're able to provide those bonds. And it's only at the prime level. So this exception is not at the subcontract level, but at the prime level, the only person who's kind of paying attention to make sure that that individual surety has the requisite assets and willingness to follow through on the promises is the contracting officer. And they're usually not in a great position to do that vetting of the individual surety. So what's surprising to me on federal contracts, they don't even find out if the individual surety has a criminal record, if they have tax liens against them, if they're in bankruptcy, anything like that. It all on the current acquisition regulations, it's all about the assets. Okay. And so if they don't kind of peel back the onion to find out what's really behind that bond, looking at the assets, then you may have a contracting agency get duped into worthless paper.
Yeah, that's not what we want to see. Martha, did you want to add?
No, it's not. I mean, for example, there have been individual sureties that have given a deed for, 400,000 acres in Wyoming.
A deed for...
But it's an illusory deed. It doesn't mean anything, and they have used it as collateral, as an asset for a number of federal projects, and that tends to come to light again when a claim is made on the bond, and there are really no assets there.
Right, and what Martha's getting at is under the current federal regulations, you can actually have real property as the asset. You could pledge that to the government.
Yeah.
And there have been instances, as Martha has mentioned, where they don't even own the property, or they've inflated the value of the real property. There was an actor who got caught, an individual surety, in Texas, and that person continued to pledge the same condominium property, which was valued at right around $200,000. And was pledging that on multi-million-dollar federal contracts.
And more than one.
Okay. And luckily, eventually, he was caught and prosecuted and, was convicted. But a lot of times, these folks can go for quite some time without really anybody scrutinizing them. And so we all have to do our due diligence, particularly producers. There is some good news, however.
Oh, that's good. We want that.
It's always great to be able to deliver good news. And that is the industry, through a concerted effort, NASBP and Surety and Fidelity Association of America, were successful in changing the asset rules that pertain to individual sureties. And that happened approximately 4 years ago. And now proposed rules have come out implementing that changed in the law under FAR case 2017-003. And that came out earlier this year, and comments were due on the proposed rules in April, and NASBP did provide comments. What is really great news is that the proposed rules really were very similar to the law that was passed and eliminated some of the assets that we thought were giving impetus to fraud. So, for example, like real property has been eliminated as a type of asset that can be pledged. Stocks and bonds on exchange also have been eliminated. And what has replaced them now is probably the safest and most stable types of assets that are described by the U.S. Treasury. So there is a Code of Federal Regulations section called 31 CFR Part 225 called Acceptable Collateral for Pledging to Federal Agencies. And that is what then now guides the types of assets that are acceptable. And they are basically all public debt obligations of the U.S. government. So think of that as Treasury notes and bonds. And those types of assets, one, very safe, stable, easily determined as to value, and on top of that can be given over to the care and custody of the federal government. And that is a critically important change to the law, and also as described in the new regulations, that now there is more control and care over those assets that are pledged. So everybody is getting to be put in a better situation with these proposed regulations. The federal government is in a better position because now they have bonds backed by real assets that are safe and stable, and they're care and custody. And also those that rely on the payment bond in case they are not paid know that there are real assets to support any indebtedness that they're going against that payment bond for. So the subcontractors and suppliers who are providing labor and materials on government construction contracts now can be assured that there is something valuable for their payment remedy. So now the federal environment is much more difficult for fraudulent actors trying to place worthless bonds. And I think then to the extent that you have a fraudulent actor trying to place worthless bonds, then state and private environments may be the areas that they try.
What that means basically is they'll stop trying to bond federal projects and they'll stay in the states to try to bond them, because there really is there's no way to really catch them unless the Department of Insurance wants to take it on and issue a cease and desist order. But that's only for that state. So they'll go to the other 49 states and they'll keep trying, but they move around geographically and they're incredibly entrepreneurial, these individual sureties. They're very creative. It's like playing whack-a-mole. If you get a cease and desist order in one state, they'll show up in another state.
It sounds like there's a lot of horror stories you could tell about that.
Unfortunately, there are. And I think Martha, again, brings up a great point that they tend to kind of recreate themselves. So once they feel like somebody's on their trail, they may change their name. They may change their location. Sometimes what they'll do is they'll use a company name but act as an individual surety, so people are confused on whether they are a surety company or an individual surety, and they kind of trade on that confusion and ambiguity. And so they're really hard to shut down.
Yeah, it sounds like that's part of the reason they act for so long, or are bad actors for so long.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I imagine that it's a pretty lucrative thing to do when you're taking in premium with no intention on paying out on claims.
Yeah.
And so they're almost incentivized to keep going. And that's unfortunate. So there's some fairly notorious individual sureties that, even despite being convicted in the past, continue to keep going.
Okay. But like you said, it's not all bad news. It's getting harder on the federal front.
Right. Federal on the front. Yeah. Harder on the federal front. As an association, NASBP is doing a lot to educate not only our own members, but also public owners and private owners about individual surety.
Seems like an important audience.
Right.
Yeah.
Martha was involved in crafting a one-page document that kind of explains in very clear terms the simple process that you take to verify a bond to make sure it's authentic. I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. Basically, when you get a bond, you want to call up the Department of Insurance or go on the website of that particular state where the bond's going to be issued and find out, is this an authorized surety insurer?
Right.
And it will let you know. Then another step you can take is looking at the Treasury list that the federal government has. It's called Circular 570 or the T list, and you can go on the website and look and see if that surety is listed, and then it will tell you under the listing which states it's licensed to do business in.
Right.
Okay.
So for corporate sureties acting on federal contracts, there is a thorough vetting process that they go through by the U.S. Department of Treasury.
Okay.
And if they meet their requirements, they are certified and put on Circular 570. And so you can look them up. The other nice thing about Circular 570 is that they actually have a phone number. There is contact information. So that second part of validating a bond is finding out if the actual surety itself has issued that. And you can do so by contacting them and finding out if they did, in fact, issue that bond.
So that's how you should validate the bond.
Right.
Okay.
Unfortunately, with individual sureties, there is no vetting. Like we said earlier, the U.S. Department of Treasury doesn't go and do advanced vetting. It's all imposed on the contracting officer who's otherwise doing this large procurement and the many facets of that. So they don't always have the time to do that due diligence. And then, on private work, there are no exceptions. So basically, if you're going to act as an individual surety on private work in a state, you got to have that certificate of authority to act as an insurer. If you don't have that, you're acting in an unauthorized manner, and that's a huge red flag for anybody who encounters that.
So that's definitely something to look for.
Absolutely.
And check on.
Yep.
Yes.
Here's where I get to say the value of a great bond producer, and that is that they know the industry inside and out. They know the reputation of sureties. They know the reputation of companies with whom they deal.
Yeah.
And so they're a great font of knowledge to find out whether something seems a little off, a little odd, or find out the reputation of a surety. It's easier to do it with a corporate surety, much more difficult with an individual surety because there's not third-party rating services, not vetting by the U.S. Department of Treasury.
Yeah.
But they'll know if something looks askew.
Okay.
And so people really need, to go to their bond producer as a first line of knowledge and defense on finding out whether or not, it's a valid bond.
Okay. Well, thank you both so much for joining us. If they need more information on this, where should they go?
www.nasbp.org.
You've been listening to Let's Get Surety, brought to you by the National Association of Surety Bond Producers. For more information about the NASBP and its members, visit nasbp.org.